Thus, the easing of U.S. sanctions on Russian oil creates a dangerous precedent. This was stated by the European Union's chief diplomat Kaja Kallas. According to her, the situation allows Moscow to raise considerable funds to wage war. Therefore, pressure on the Russian Federation needs to be increased.
It is important that attention to the Middle East does not distract from Ukraine, so that this focus does not fade. We see that the weakening of American oil sanctions against Russia is a dangerous precedent. Right now, we need them to have less money to wage war, not more. And of course, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is also beneficial for Russia in financing its aggression. Therefore, we definitely need to do more in this direction.
Pressure on Russia needs to be increased, particularly in the context of preparing the 20th package of sanctions, since Moscow's revenues have grown due to the escalation in the Middle East. This was stated yesterday before the start of the EU Foreign Affairs Council meeting by Romanian Foreign Minister Oanatoiu.
The €90 billion loan must be disbursed immediately. However, it is encouraging that together in the EU we have decided to extend sanctions against Russia for another 6 months. We need to do even more to increase the pressure, especially considering that the Kremlin now has an additional source of income, profits from oil, which used to be significantly lower. That means we should continue to intensify the pressure as we prepare the 20th package of sanctions. Oanatoiu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania.
We will discuss this topic right now. Joining us now is Ihor Burakovsky, Chairman of the Board of the Institute for Economic Research and Policy Consulting. We are glad to welcome you on air, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Good afternoon.
Ihor Valentinovich, tell us, if we talk about the interpretation that the European Union gives to this easing of sanctions by the United States, could this really set a precedent? And shouldn't this be seen as a certain, tactical move, as Donald Trump and, in general, representatives of his administration keep saying every time?
Well, I want to say right away that Trump's policy is based on pursuing his own interests. His interests lie in showing how he, so to speak, is bringing back America's former greatness, with all the consequences that follow, especially when it comes to easing sanctions against the Russian Federation. This is essentially about supporting his own image in connection with the problems that arose at the start of the operation against Iran. So as they say, it's nothing personal here. Ukraine or any values have nothing to do with it. Trump, so to speak, has elections this year. In this case, we're talking about the local parliament, the local Congress. That's it. And that's why, so to speak, these are the kinds of actions we're seeing. But on the other hand, it's clear that when it comes to those same oil sanctions, there is already a certain level of disagreement between the United States of America and the European Union. At one particular point in time, the member nations of the Group of Seven imposed a series of rather strong and stringent restrictions, specifically a price cap of $60 per barrel on crude oil being transported across the sea. And in this way, a fairly effective and concerted attempt was made to block the potential oil and gas revenues flowing to the Russian Federation. Then the European Union put forward an initiative to lower this price cap to about $44 and called on all other countries to join in. America did not join this initiative, so indeed steps of this kind generally create problems for coordinating actions among Ukraine's allies.
Igor Valentinovich, if we talk about the profit, yes, essentially the gain and financial result that the Russian Federation receives as a result of these sanction relaxations by the United States of America. Help us calculate, yes, what additional benefit the budget of the Russian Federation receives.
Well, I want to say right away that it's quite difficult to calculate this today. Why? Because each contract has its own specifics. There are certainly contracts that have already been paid for, and the money, so to speak, has been received, but the oil cannot be unloaded for certain reasons. There is certainly oil that is currently floating around. It has sort of been shipped, meaning payment will come later. So it's unclear what will happen here. And besides that, the structure of the payments themselves is unclear. Because if we look closely at where the oil will go, the oil will, roughly speaking, go to the so-called Asian region, right? It won't go somewhere to Europe or to some other, so to speak, countries. It will obviously be concentrated here. Why? Because it is precisely the countries of this region, those located, so to speak, near the bottleneck of the Persian Gulf, that are currently suffering the most from the problems in the Strait of Hormuz. And this really is a problem for them. What will happen next, so to speak? Well, again, India receives oil, and it's clear that it will take advantage of this opportunity because, so to speak, it is always ready to work with Indian oil. But in India, two questions immediately arise, so to speak. The first question is about payments. The problem of settling payments has not yet been fully resolved. Indian rupees, generally speaking, are not a freely convertible currency. Therefore, yes, on the one hand, Russia does receive some money, but then again, it is necessary to set up rather complicated schemes to, so to speak, convert these rupees into something else, then into something else again, and in the end, to finally get actual real money. The second point is what Russia actually earns. After all, we are talking about oil revenues as a whole, right? That is, in this case, roughly speaking, a barrel of oil costs, say, $60, and Russia receives $60. But that's not quite accurate because a significant portion of this money actually belongs to the companies themselves. That's it. They need to cover their own expenses, so to speak. The expenses of these oil companies are increasing today because they need to modernize something, and generally speaking, they are losing their markets. That's why they need to have some kind of financial cushion. So I'm not sure that all oil companies will cheerfully and quickly transfer these, let's say, oil revenues in dollars or whatever, to the Russian Federation. And finally, the third point is that, again, on the one hand, yes, revenues will increase. You can cite various figures, but the problem is that expenses in the Russian Federation are even higher. And the increase in oil revenues does not, so to speak, cover the budget gap. And the budget, which after just the first 2.5 months has practically already reached its annual deficit. So yes, this is a kind of pleasant bonus for Putin, which he earned effortlessly, so to speak. It just fell from the sky, this stroke of luck. But this, so to speak, does not solve all of Russia's problems. And the fact that the Russian Federation is currently in a rather difficult economic situation is something that practically everyone acknowledges. And it's clear that depriving it of such bonuses, whether from oil or something else, and increasing the pressure is, in general, the most favorable development one could have hoped for after 4 years of Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Igor Valentinovich, so what do you think, if we put the question this way? What is the main goal of these sanctions and pressure from the United States of America? Is it to somehow stabilize the global situation, the prices, yes, forwards, futures, and overall, to somehow cool down the market so that everyone calms down and starts thinking about the long-term perspective, about how to get out of this situation? Or is this really a story that, in fact, is primarily aimed at India and at Putin himself?
I think that above all, these are considerations of a global nature. And if you take a close look at the oil market, what sources actually exist today to cover the temporary shortage? Not a shortage of oil itself, but a shortage of transportable oil. There is oil, there is plenty of oil in the world, so to speak, but getting it out, so to speak, is quite...
Transporting it, yes.
Well, the first source that is being discussed today is, of course, tapping into strategic reserves. And in principle, according to various estimates today, strategic reserves make it possible for the so-called world, or let's say the markets, to hold out for about 30 to 60 days, and in some cases even up to 90 days in certain countries. How willing they are to do this and what the mechanism will be for releasing these oil reserves, that is in fact the first question. And the second question is essentially the attempt to somehow redirect the flows. Yes. That is, roughly speaking, to take advantage of certain opportunities, for example, the ports of the Red Sea, so to speak, to shift things a bit in another direction. But here too, there is, so to speak, a major problem. Here too, the problem is that, in fact, the infrastructure has always been tailored specifically for the Persian Gulf and, roughly speaking, for the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, it's quite difficult to change all of this quickly. And so to speak, the next point is that, theoretically, countries that are not directly connected to this region, yes, those that do not have the Strait of Hormuz problem, they could increase oil production with all the consequences that follow from that. This oil would be transported along, so to speak, other routes. But apparently today the situation, according to the assessment, let's say, of Trump himself, or rather not so much Trump as his analysts, is that a fairly large amount of oil needs to be released onto the market today. And to release this large amount of oil and to do it very quickly, so to speak, there are basically two ways: to bring up what is already afloat, to bring it, so to speak, onto the market. This is, for example, Russian oil. And on the other hand, so to speak, to try somehow to unblock the Strait of Hormuz. But how this will look and when it will happen is, generally speaking, still an open question today. Well, that's the situation, so to speak, where objective and subjective, current and, so to speak, fundamental factors are intertwined. Well, there's another point that's also very important, so to speak. When we analyze the situation in the oil market, we must not forget that, as one expert said, price formation in the oil market is rather, nervous in nature. That is, if any problems arise, if someone notices these problems, immediately a large group of, so to speak, oil speculators gets involved, as well as a large group of people who try to play either for a decrease or for an increase. And this speculative aspect so far, at least I haven't seen any assessments. There haven't been and aren't any attempts to separate, so to speak, what is truly related to issues of supply and demand from everything else. And as they say, there are always more and more points that could be added. Let's not forget about these oil futures that everyone is talking about today. What is a future? A future is essentially a contract for the delivery of a commodity at a certain price after a specified period of time. For example, let's say in 3 months, in half a year, or in a year. But every commodity market has its own futures, so to speak, and its own specific features. And these oil futures, these oil contracts, are used not only in the oil industry for buying and selling oil, but also as a financial instrument. That is, I want to somehow minimize my financial risks. I see, so to speak, that oil prices are going to rise. Therefore, today I buy oil at one price so that I can later resell this contract, so to speak, at a different price in the future. And this aspect, so to speak, also needs to be taken into account when analyzing the market. So you see, as they say, there is a very complex intertwining here, a complicated interweaving of different trends and different motives.